good morning and welcome to Citing Julia, and here, Citing Julia in France. I am Philadelphia Cousins, one of Julia's nieces, daughter of Dorothy, Julia's younger sister, and Ivan Cousins. I will be moderating this panel, but before citing Julia in France and introducing this panel of experts, and there are many other Julia experts here, let me introduce a few Julia experts right here in the audience. Several of my family members of the McWilliams clan are here. My brother Sam Cousins, my cousins, who are the children of Julia and Dort's much-beloved brother John, Carol Gibson, David McWilliams, and Patty McWilliams. David's wife, Rachel Kurland, also knew Julia really well. We, the McWilliams clan, tend to gather in groups. We also hoot at each other. Boop, boop. Also in the audience are many of the beloved and trusted friends and colleagues of Julia. Pat Pratt, Bill and Mimi Truslow, Rebecca Alcid, Jim Dodge, and Susie Davidson. And lastly, we have a member of our cinematic family, the actor Michael Brian Dunn, who played Ivan Cousins, Dorothy's husband, in Nora Ephron's movie Julie and Julia. So a large extended family. I guess I'm also a Julia expert of sorts and have many memories of her in France. Sam and I grew up being regaled by our parents with stories about their time in Paris with Julia and Paul after the Second World War. My personal favorite, summarized by Alex Prud'homme and Julia in My Life in France, is the story of our 6'5" mother Dorothy being rear-ended while driving her Citroën in Paris around 1949. She stood up through the sunroof and stated loudly and clearly, "Cet homme a craché dans ma derrière." The gendarme said, "Mademoiselle, I do not think you wanted to say that." And all the gaping and tiny Parisian bystanders burst into laughter. Confused, Mom returned to Rue de Lou, Julia and Paul's apartment, to have Paul explain, "Dorothy, you said this man has spit into my ass." That was Mom. Great. I was with Julia a couple times in France, once in the summer of 1984. I had just finished lunch with Julia and Paul on the flagstone patio of their house at La Pichoune, their Provence home. The patio looked over to a tiny town, Place Cassier, that sat on a hill that had a church with a little bell tower. Julia felt there was a deep connection between France and the US and often talked about that. And she told me of sitting in the exact same spot in June of 1968, the day Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Oh, I tear up every time I tell this story. She said the bell in the church tower rang and rang all day for Bobby. Paul was somber. Julia teared up, and I also began to cry. We went on to cry about those we had lost, her parents, Ivan, my dad, Charlie, and then on to much-loved and departed pets. We had a good cry. Julia could be very, very tender-hearted. While Julia could be tender-hearted, she was also extremely practical, particularly about moving on in her life. A final memory of Julia in France is in June 1992, the trip with my husband, Bob, our infant son, Nick, Susie Davidson, and I took with Julia to help her close down La Pichoune, her lovely little rose-stuccoed house covered with bougainvillea near Grasse. She was turning it over to the relatives of Simca, Simon Beck, co-author of Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volumes 1 and 2, with her. It was Julia's last time there, at this home imbued with memories of Paul and Simca and other dear friends and her life in France. Julia went about the task of packing up with gusto, also found time for visits with friends, many great meals at home and out. She even played a round of golf at 80. I felt very sad about leaving and expected Julia to be sad also, but not really. She was closing this chapter of her life and going forward. No tears, no sentimentality. On to the next. And with that, on to the next with a presentation by our panelists about Julia in France. And as someone said earlier, each panelist is going to talk, and then we will have time for questions after that. And we will leave you plenty of time, don't worry. So the three panelists who are going to be talking about citing Julia in France are Dr. Alice Kaplan, who is a writer and translator of French. She currently chairs the French department at Yale University, where she is the John M. Musser Chair of French. Dr. Kaplan has spent her career researching and telling stories about France, past and present, history and literature, personal and political. She has written several books about France, French Lessons, The Collaborator, The Interpreter, and her most recent work, Dreaming in French, The Paris Years of Jacqueline Bouvier-Kennedy, Susan Sontag, and Angela Davis, explores and celebrates France's culture and its an enduring appeal to Americans. And perhaps most importantly, Dr. Kaplan wrote me that she tasted her first soufflé au Grand Marnier as a teenager in Paris in 1970 and has never turned back, has never looked back. Dr. Kaplan will be placing this discussion of Julia in France in its post-World War II historical, cultural, and literary context. Our second panelist is Bob Spitz. He has recently written a biography of Julia entitled Dearie. In addition, Mr. Spitz has written several other nonfiction books, including biographies of the Beatles and Bob Dylan. He has also worked with Bruce Springsteen and Elton John and published many articles, including in the New York Times, Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and Oprah's magazine. Mr. Spitz will be discussing Julia and Paul's early years in France, including Julia's first meal of Sol Meunier in Rouen, and their life at Rue de Lou, their apartment in Paris. Our final panelist is Alex Prud'homme, right here, who is the great-nephew of Paul Child. Mr. Prud'homme's grandfather, Charlie, was Paul's identical twin brother. Aside from looking a bit like Paul and Charlie, and having spent many hours with Julia and Paul and vacations with them in France, Mr. Prud'homme co-authored with Julia the memoir, My Life in France. This book was the basis for parts of the screenplay for Nora Ephron's movie, Julia and Julia. Mr. Prud'homme has also written several other books, Forewarned, about terrorism, The Cell Game, about the biotech industry, and most recently, The Ripple Effect, about the state of the world's water supply. He has also written articles for the New York Times, Esquire, Vanity Fair, and the New Yorker. Mr. Prud'homme will discuss Julia's later years in France and her time at La Pichoune, the beloved house in Provence. So I will now turn over the discussion to Dr. Kaplan.
Okay, I think I need to go near my slides. I want to show you what France looked like. Get me back to my first. Okay, I want to show you what France looked like in 1944 when the occupation ended. I've got a few minutes here. It's in French, but you can read the translation. Oops. Somehow there's no sound.
La France a recouvré sa liberté, mais elle est en ruine. De Boulogne à Brest, ports, chemins de fer, gares, habitations, tout est par terre. Plus de 2000 épaves flottent dans les bassins portuaires. 425 000 immeubles et 3000 ponts ont été détruits. La reconstruction, tâche immense, commence.
So it's a somber place. They arrive. Paul is going to work for the U.S. Information Service. They get off the boat in Le Havre, and what they see first is the American work of reconstruction. Le Havre is non-French, Paul Child writes. The harbor, that is. All big American cranes, piles of bricks, empty spaces, and still a few rusting, half-sunk hulks. Now, most of us have a prettier image of Julia Child's post-war France from the film Julia and Julia, with its charming recreations of market street scenes and interiors. And here is the street scene from Julia and Julia. But look at this view of Paris from a 1949 newsreel. This is the Gare Saint-Lazare. Now compare the same building today. What's the difference? The difference is that Marot had the idea in 1962 of scraping the buildings clean. Somebody said to him, wouldn't it be cheaper just to blacken the Sacré-Cœur? But he scraped. So you really need to take the movie Julia and Julia and adjust it for color. A city that in 1948, 49, 1950 was sooty and dark. It was Julia's interior happiness, her taste for France, her joyous marriage, I think, that made everything light up for her. For the French, I would say it was different. Historian Henri Rousseau has called 1944-1945 a period of unfinished mourning. The quick purge of collaborators had not taken care of French guilt over the deportation of 75,000 Jews and Vichy's cooperation with the Nazis. De Gaulle had spun the post-war narrative as a tale of triumph rather than defeat and rescue. France had sat as a victor at the Nuremberg trials, despite the fact that the country had fallen to the Nazis in 6 weeks and endured foreign occupation for the subsequent 4 years. Liberation came with a lot of US help, more than de Gaulle cared to admit, and the help was still annoying. It gives you a twinge to think of blood running in our familiar gutters so short a time ago, Paul wrote his brother. The memory of the war was everywhere for the Childs. In Rouen, scene of the famous Saulmonière meal, where the cathedral had just survived an Allied bombing in 1944. On streets renamed after resistance martyrs. You would have seen ceremonies still all over the place in 49. And in sweet private details of commemoration. The child's friend Jean Ash, a Buchenwald survivor and decorated resistance hero, named his cat Maquis. The Maquis were the resistance fighters in the hills. But Maquis, he claimed, was also short for MacArthur. So this was a cat who swung both ways, and apparently very good friends with Julia's cat, Minette. 1948 brought the Marshall Plan, and with it, a return to normalcy, the new normal, as we might say today. There were still coal shortages, and the Childs gathered around a single coal stove in the parlor and closed up the other rooms. Julia figured out that their landlady was probably renting to them to pay for her coal. As far as food went, they had arrived just at the right time. 1948 brought the first good wheat harvest since the war and the beginning of the end of rationing. Can you tell whose ration card this is from 1949? No. Jackie Bouvier, future First Lady, is also in Paris in 1949 on the Smith Junior Year Abroad program, and I found her ration card doing research for my book, Dreaming in French, which features her and some of her friends who actually sat in on those Cordon Bleu classes with Julia Child. The Marshall Plan in 48, 49 sent potatoes, dried fruit, powdered eggs, cigarettes, and chewing gum to France, when what the French really wanted was milk, wheat, and fats. And because of a linguistic mistake by a French official schooled in England, corn flour arrived instead of wheat, making the baguettes yellow. In restaurants, you could hear people talking about this yellow bread as the American curse. Now, food shortages don't seem to have deprived Julia and Paul of anything. Though Julia did write to a friend in 1949 to please send coffee because the ration was minuscule, and you still couldn't buy butter, cheese, coffee, or sugar. Prices were terrible for everything except vegetables. As we know, Julia needed to dip into her inheritance to support their heavy restaurant habit. Now, in setting the scene so quickly for you, I want to at least say a word about politics in Paris in the late 1940s, about the all-important French Communist Party. Paul and Julia Child were in tune with many intellectuals on the French left who were looking for an alternative to communism, a non-Stalinist left, and I guess that somebody like Albert Camus would be the prime example of this left. Paris, though, was at least 25% communist in 1948. On Sundays, you could see the party cadres selling issues of the communist daily, L'Humanité, on every street corner, outnumbering the churchgoers. Paul Child would later be interrogated by McCarthy's witch hunters. To his father-in-law, too, he was a communist type. But when it came to the French Communist Party, he was wary. He wrote home in 1950 that Marx had opened a Pandora's box, that communism's electric current was shocking, burning, and changing the world. Julia Child bemoaned the fact that the enormous general strike of March 1950 meant no working icebox, hence her Minette's French cat food was spoiling. But she also goes into useful detail about the demand for an increase in the living wage. How anyone lives off $45 a month, I don't know. We have enough trouble on 8 times that amount, she wrote. It was impossible for any American in Paris to ignore the regular general strikes, shown here, or the enormous rally protesting the arrival of General Ridgway to head up NATO in 1952. And I've got some film footage from the Communist Film Archive, which is really pretty wonderful. You see the vehemence, Ridgway go home, Yankees go home, and so on. So these kind of massive demonstrations that are absent, obviously, from the film Julia and Julia, were part of everyday life in Julia and Paul Child's Paris. Meanwhile, as he was organizing the art and photo exhibits for the cultural branch of the Marshall Plan, Paul Child made fun of American attempts to modernize the French economy. In a letter home, he imagines the average French patron protesting, "We have a nice little business here. Everyone makes a decent living. Nobody has ulcers. I have time to work on my monograph about Balzac. And my foreman is just as much interested in his espaliered pear trees as I am in Balzac." I must confess, Child concludes, that I am very much in sympathy with the philosophical aspects of their position. Now, what kind of expates were Paul and Julia Child? Janet Flanner called them the Apollonian Americans in Paris. I love this formula, as opposed to, I suppose, the Dionysian revelers, the world-weary GIs embracing irresponsibility that James Baldwin talks about. Julia and Paul looked askance both at the American students crowding the bars in Saint-Germain, existential girls wearing dirty raincoats, as Paul said, and at the embassy crowd, dowagers with black feathers, pearls, satin dresses, and ravaged worldly faces, according to Julia's description. Julia complained in her letters about a christening where the American host served white cake from a mix, and the decor looked like Home and Garden magazine. Well before she started studying cooking, she wrote in her date books every dish she ate, every restaurant she went to, every cocktail party, abbreviation CT. At first I thought it was Connecticut. Every museum, every theater outing, every stomachache. There's a whole post-war history of France in these Schlesinger papers. Finally, for imagining Julia in her 1948-1952 scene, it's very helpful to conjure her physically. And one thing that the film Julia and Julia really gets right is her height. The average French male in 1949 measured 5'6", and I suspect that the statistician was a Frenchman. A little shorter than that. Julia Child was 6'3". I have it from authentic family sources. Her sister's 6'5". She's in a great tradition. Post-war French literature is full of descriptions of the shock the French felt at the arrival of the GIs at the Liberation. Who were these enormous people with their long legs, their big muscles, their straight white teeth? And women, too? The famous photo of Julia at her stove in the Schlesinger collection is telling, as is this really nice still from Julia and Julia, where she doesn't quite fill her French bed. I like to imagine her wandering through the outdoor markets of Paris, head and shoulders above the Frenchmen in the crowd, taking in the centuries-old vendors' cries and experimenting with her own pronunciation in the booming falsetto that became a source of so many affectionate imitations. Being so tall, so different, though, didn't keep her from being intimate with the French. Her telephone books list the names of her poultry vendor, her cheese man, her wine merchant, along with her distinguished French art historian friends, longtime expatriates like Jerome Hill down at his villa in Cassis, and photographers like Henri Cartier-Bresson. Paul and Julia Child were Americans in Paris who didn't want to be typical Americans. With Paul Child's French and deep knowledge of the place, there was little risk of that. After a trip to the mosque, the Paris mosque, on a January Sunday in 1949, after finding the restaurant closed, Paul Child had to remind himself to slow down. And he writes so beautifully, "Julie has yet to run a flood of mint tea and couscous over her tongue. But I keep saying to myself, my God, we got 2 years, so why worry? Ce sera pour une autre fois." Anyways, both croissant and brioche are beginning to appear in the pâtisserie. So should we worry? Thank you.
And now, Mr. Spitz will speak.
Okay. Thank you, Phyla. So many of you here today. Laura's right. Julia was an incredibly modest woman, but she would have loved this. No doubt about it. And it's also nice to be back here. I do want to say, after spending so much time researching my book at the Schlesinger Library, to say that that facility is a dream to biographers and a dream to anybody doing really serious research, let alone the fact that they've got incredible archives. That room is gorgeous, and if you haven't seen it or been over there, oh, just get over and soak it all in. And the staff, too. Really happy to be back. And also to see everyone from the McWilliams, Child, and Cousins clan. I know that a lot of you must have bones to pick with me, and I may slip out before you can get your hands on me later on. I know it's perhaps early in the symposium, but if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm about to go rogue. Yes, I'll cite Julia early in France, perhaps the most important locus of her remarkable career. But unlike the other tour guides you'll hear throughout the day, I had the unique pleasure to encounter her in Sicily, of all places. So let's take just a brief detour there, if you will. It won't be long, I promise you. It was 1992, and I was on assignment for several American magazines with a large dollop of what the Italians called il dolce far niente, just soaking it all in. when I got a call from a friend at the Italian Trade Commission. I know you've got some extra time on your hands, she said, and wondered if you wouldn't mind acting as an escort for an older woman. Really, I'm not making this up. Lady, I don't do that kind of work, I told her. She said, oh, too bad. It's for Julia Child. I'll be right over, I told her. And that was the beginning of an incredible adventure. I was 42, she was 82. I was 6 feet tall, she was much taller. She called me Dearie. She called me Dearie. It wasn't until later that I found out that Julia called everybody Dearie, including the local beggars and the feral town dog. But for the next 3.5 weeks, as we crisscrossed Sicily together, eating food that Julia found, shall we say, wanting, she reflected meditatively on those earliest days in France. As you know, Julia first set foot on French soil on November 3rd, 1948, a day that would forever remain as perhaps one of the turning points in her life. She and Paul had endured a brutal 5-day crossing from New York through squalls the size of skyscrapers and dense clouds of fog. And when they landed at Le Havre at dawn, the last thing that Julia was thinking of was food, French or otherwise. But not so Paul. He'd been extolling the delights of French food since they'd met in Ceylon, and was intent that their first meal be one for the record books. He'd picked out a restaurant in Rouen, of all places, about a 2-hour drive from the port, Restaurant La Couronne, which according to the Guide Michelin was the oldest establishment of its kind in France. Julia had recognized Rouen from the newsreels and, of course, the pictures we saw today. The neighborhoods close to the Seine, where the city was burned during the war, the damaged Notre Dame Cathedral from Monet's dusky studies, and the fabled Gros Horloge, the astronomical clock with its sun and moon phases in exquisite detail. They bumped over those cobblestone streets to the Vieux Marché, the medieval town square where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in 1431. And there, just opposite those timbered shops, was Restaurant La Couronne. It was a pretty nondescript joint, a rather drab room in a rather drab old hotel, white tablecloths, humorless French waiters. Julia told me how she felt like an alien at the time who just landed on Earth. She had no idea what to order from that incomprehensible menu in front of her, no sense of the tradition of lunch. She was tired, exhausted, but her appetite had returned. Julia's appetite always managed to return. And the strangeness of her circumstances, it was riling her. Fortunately, Paul swooped in to the rescue. He'd do the ordering and serve up the explanations of the contents of the platters that landed in front of them. Now, close your eyes for a moment and picture Julia Child's face sitting unsuspectingly at that table at La Couronne as first a lightly chilled Chablis was poured for her. Wine. I had never drunk much wine other than some $1.19 California Burgundy, she recalled, and certainly not in the middle of the day. Then came oysters on the half shell, Portugueses, that tasted fruity and, as Julia said, very strong of the sea. Paul bypassed the house specialty, which was pressed duck, in favor of fish. They'd have fish. Endeavoring to keep it simple, he chose sole meunière. What a stroke of genius. Sole meunière, sole cooked like an omelet in nothing but a bath of clarified Norman butter. Not the sheetrock that Julia's mother had made in Pasadena, but honest-to-God sole that oozed a geyser of juices. Ladies and gentlemen, this is it. This is the moment when she put that forkful of sole in her mouth that Julia Child officially ascended into history. It changed everything, and right there in that restaurant in Rouen, what a revelation that meal was to Julia. It had made a life-changing impression on her, showing her what it really meant to eat, not simply to fill her stomach with food, but to eat, to savor each glorious mouthful with gusto. If there was one incident that led to her future distinction, that lunch in Rouen, as she often referred to it, was the culprit. As she herself put it, it was the most exciting meal of my life. Well, the next days in Paris were no less impressionable. That city took my breath away, she recalled almost 50 years later. I couldn't get over how gorgeous everything looked. The beauty of the buildings and the Seine, the majesty of it all. Paris was catnip for Julia. It had everything she craved. Gorgeous architecture, dynamic style, vivacious people, ubiquitous culture, and a recipe for a living that seethed with passion. She loved walking from neighborhood to neighborhood, poking into every interesting shop. She could sit for hours at a congenial outdoor cafe, enjoying the endless pedestrian parade that never failed to entertain. What Paris didn't have at the outset was the answer to her dilemma, something that offered her a meaningful role for her life. Julia was done with the type of mundane government work that had engaged her during World War II, and she was bored with being just a bureaucrat's wife. She wanted a greater outlet for her creativity than just pleasing a man, although she was very happy to please her man. So she floundered at what that outlet could be. A friend suggested that if she enjoyed French food so much, she might consider taking cooking classes at Le Cordon Bleu. A good friend indeed. It was the only school where professional chefs taught traditional French cooking in a serious, hands-on atmosphere. Again, I ask you to close your eyes and picture Julia Child, 37 years old, striding through a door of a Renaissance-style building beneath a sign that says only École de Cuisine on the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré. It's October 6, 1949, 8:30 in the morning. Inside the halls, chaos. It reminded Julia of what she called a madcap bedroom farce. Julia eventually came face to face with Madame Brassard, the school's despotic headmistress, who was unwilling to give an American, much less a strong-willed, spirited American woman, the secrets of authentic French cuisine. Instead, she banished Julia to a class in the basement that began just after sunup with 11 hulking American GIs. This was a ragtag outfit indeed. Army mess cooks, butchers, hot dog vendors, bakers. They'd cook the kind of food best called grub and only sought to build on that turf. Julia, to her credit, took that class where she wanted it to go, which was into the stratosphere, the classic French cooking stratosphere. She pushed her instructor, Chef Max Bounard, to take her beyond the bare basics, to guide her through the secrets of Escoffier. Here, she learned the most important lesson of her future career, technique, understanding the fundamental principles that underlie each and every recipe, and learning how to execute them with proficiency and with style. Mastering, mastering, mastering. Julie was more than willing to put in the effort, and the minute class was over at 9:30 in the morning, she made a beeline for the market on the Rue de Bourgogne, where they had not only the market, but the crèmerie, the fromagière, and a few doors down, the fishmonger at the corner, and the wine merchant, Nicolas, right around the block, scooping up ingredients before heading home to duplicate a dish she'd just learned. Mastering, mastering. Again, mastering. There was so much to learn and so much to practice. After 7 weeks at Le Cordon Bleu, she realized, I may have just put my foot in the door. At least cooking for Julia was engagement enough. Cooking gave her structure. It was substantive, meaningful. It brought her accomplishment and independence, everything she'd so long desired. The mysteries of French cuisine were starting to make sense. But by the spring of 1950, frustration had set in. The classes began to repeat. Quiche Lorraine, 16 times. Veal Blanquette, 12. Saumonier so often that the students lost count. Julia became, her words, increasingly disappointed in that damn poorly managed school. She had also grown disenchanted with her role as embassy wife. Her ongoing life in Paris with Paul filled a hole in Julia's development. It helped her enormously to establish an identity all her own. But she dreaded turning into the obedient little woman. Julia bristled at situations that required her, or any woman, to function as window dressing. At first, the embassy receptions that they were required to attend were fun. But in time, the profusion of special events, galas, benefits, and parties began to blur and fatigue. Julia considered them a wretched nuisance, and she chafed at the spectacle. Here's a description from one of her early diary entries. Government wives freshly manicured, she wrote, waved and perfumed, twitching and shaking in their off-shoulder dresses, pulling up fronts to cover titties, flushed with excitement, men all like crows in black and white. It was a stultifying scene that she grew to loathe. But in 1951, at yet another cocktail party at the Parisian home of an American executive, Julia met a woman who would rekindle her passion, which is the point in the story where my role as your guide, or I guess I should say your escort, ends on this continuing remarkable journey that was Julia Child's life. Thank you very much.
And Alex Prud'homme.
Good morning, all. Thank you for coming. This is a wonderful event, and as Bob said, I know that Julia would be very happy to see you all here. I'm going to cite Julia in 3 key places. Paris, 1951, when she met her collaborators Simone Beck and Loisette Berthold. Site 2 spans from Paris in 1952 to New York in 1961, when Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volume 1 was written and finally published. And Site 3 is La Pichoune, the little thing, Julia's house in Place Cassier in Provence. So Site 1 is Paris in 1951. As Alice so ably demonstrated, even in 1951, Paris still was suffering from the effects of the war. I remember Julia telling me that they could see bullet holes in the walls. There were plaques for the resistance fighters that had been shot by the Germans. The power grid would sometimes brown out. They would run out of supplies. It wasn't exactly camping in Maine, she said, but it was getting close, especially in the winters when it got very cold and their heat didn't work. On top of that, they were in the midst of the Cold War. And because Paul worked at the U.S. Embassy, they were acutely aware of the tensions in the air. And Julia felt that it was quite possible that at any minute the Russians could be rolling down the Champs-Élysées in their tanks. And she was prepared to man the barricades. But in the meantime, Julia, remained undeterred, as was her wont, and she decided to become as French as possible. She did go to the Cordon Bleu and dove headfirst into that, but one of the most important things that she learned in that period was how to shop like a true French person. In America, we go into a supermarket and we buy a piece of meat that's wrapped in plastic, and we give it to the cashier, and we're out of there in about 30 seconds. In France, Julia discovered, to her great satisfaction, shopping meant going to the local marketplace and talking to each vendor. And you didn't start by talking to the butcher about his cuts of meat. You talked to him about the weather, and you asked about his daughter. And then you eventually asked him what he was cooking. And then after about a half an hour, he'd start showing you the really good cuts of meat. And by the way, giving you some techniques on how he prepares them. And in this way, Julia not only educated herself about food and cooking, but she built up what she liked to call les human relations, which is a typical Julia phrase. She loved people, as you all know, and it was very genuine, and she was, as Paul said, she could charm a polecat. And so she got to know everybody in the marketplace and used her daily shopping excursions as a way of extracting information and becoming French. In the fall of 1951, Julia had joined a group called Les Cercles des Gourmettes, which is a well-established women's cooking group. And in that fall, she met a gourmet named Simone Beck, Simca Beck, at a party, who she described as, quote, a tall, dashing, vigorous Française of about 42, with blonde hair, pale skin, high cheekbones, dark-rimmed glasses, and firmly held convictions. I met Simca a few times, and she was out of central casting. She was a very opinionated French woman, vivacious, and you were never quite sure what she would do next. She had a tremendous amount of energy, as Julia did, and the two of them recognized each other as soulmates pretty quickly, and they would drive each other onward and ever onward. Simca was raised as an aristocrat in Normandy, and she had studied a little bit of English in England and with some English nannies, but her English was not great. But they sort of spoke a franglais together. Simca had also attended the Cordon Bleu, and Julia described her as a mad cook who specialized in pastries and desserts. But Simca also knew about the darker side of food and about deprivation. Her family home in Provence was called Bramafam, which roughly translates as the cry of hunger. And during the war, her husband, Jean-Fiche Bachet, was imprisoned by the Nazis, and Simca would send him notes sewn inside prunes that were smuggled in. Julia and Simca met a friend of Simca's named Loisette Berthold, who was a lovely woman who liked to cook, but Loisette was married and had kids, and she didn't have the energy of Julia and Simca. And the three of them began a little cooking school called L'École des Trois Gourmands, which Julia translates as the School of the Three Hearty Eaters. Most of the students were Americans. The charge was $20 for 3 classes, and they worked up some excellent recipes that were clearly thought out and very precise in order to teach. And Julia was so enthusiastic about this, she said, I'd gladly pay my students to be allowed to teach them because I learn so much every time. And this goes back to some points made earlier, that Julia saw herself as a teacher. She also saw herself as a student. She told me that she thought of herself as an eternal pupil. And even at the very end of her life, when we were working on her memoir together, at age 91, she was talking about how she wanted to go to a Chicago slaughterhouse. She wanted to get out on a lobster boat in Maine. She wanted to teach kids cooking. She was constantly moving forward, constantly gathering information. Paul noted that Julia practically did pay the students. He thought that they were operating the school at a loss because they would buy so many supplies and so much cookware that there's no way they could have broken even on it. But Julia, again, was learning all the way. At this point, she had read all of the great French cookbooks, the classics like La Russe Gastronomique, Alibab, and Kernowski, but she couldn't find a French cookbook for Americans. Well, it turned out that Simca and Loisette were working on just such a book, but it wasn't going very well, and then their American collaborator disappeared. And the two French women rather shyly asked Julia if she'd possibly be willing to help them finish their book. And the words were barely out of their mouths when Julia jumped on them and said, "Mais oui!" It was the moment she had been waiting for. And this was the beginning of their collaboration, what she liked to call the cookery bookery. And this brings me to Site 2, the cookery bookery, which takes us from Paris to Marseille, to Germany, to Washington, to Oslo, and then here to Cambridge. and it spanned nearly a decade. But I really think of this as a state of mind more than a place. This site is really about Julia becoming the Julia that we all know, defining herself for herself as well as her friends and her husband and her students through the book. And as Laura Shapiro noted, the book itself was becoming an entity beyond the three writers. It became, in a sense, a person on its own. It became a force of nature that they had willingly enslaved themselves to. So in September of 1952, Julia sat down to read what Simca and Loisette had produced, and what she found was a jumble of recipes in which the language was not American and the book was needlessly complicated. In fact, she wrote, "I don't like it at all." On the other hand, she knew this was a great opportunity and added, "There's no other book like it." In her very nice, enthusiastic, quietly determined way, Julia essentially took the project over and planned an entirely new book, based largely on what she called the clear, informative, accurate recipes they had developed for their cooking classes. Julia had a logical and practical mind, and she tailored the new book for the American audience. Her ideal audience was herself and her friends and her family. And in the course of working out recipes, Julia became something of an investigative reporter. She and Paul would spend hours walking all over Paris, trying little cafes and restaurants of all different qualities. And she would take notes, and Paul would often take photographs. But one of her favorite things to do would be to find a lovely little restaurant that specialized in a dish, say beurre blanc, and either take notes and rush home and reverse engineer that in her Rue de Lou lab, or charm the chef into giving her the closely guarded recipe, which he or she would often do because they couldn't imagine what this 6'3" American in pearls could possibly do with it. So she'd work on her own variations of these recipes. She would, as Bob noted, she would make dishes 10 or 12 or 16 times to make sure that she had made all the mistakes that her readers and her students might possibly make. She'd try them out on Simca and Loisette, and then she'd send them here to the States to my grandmother and to her sister Dorothy and to various friends. And relying on her OSS training, she would always write "top secret" on the top. "Your eyes only," as if she were Jane Bond sending secret missives, because she was very aware of how competitive the cookbook market was. And she didn't want anybody to get onto the idea that it would be a good idea to do a French cooking book for the American market. Paul, also known as Guinea Pig Number 1, was her chief recipe tester, photographer, restaurant wrangler, and writing coach. And as they tinkered at the Rue de Lou, he and Julia invented a new way to illustrate cookbooks. Paul was a photographer and artist, and they developed a method where Julia would be working on, say, a piece of chicken, and he would come from behind and shoot down over her shoulder so that you are illustrating the food preparation from the cook's perspective. This was radical, and it was a sort of an intuitive process. They were constantly working ideas off each other. And Paul was a very important force behind the scenes. And until that point, cookbooks had been illustrated from the audience's perspective, which of course isn't so helpful when you're trying to truss a chicken or prepare a custard or what have you. So at this point, the book is now growing in pages as particularly Simca and Julia become what they called les vaches enragées, the mad cows, who were clickety-clacketing on their typewriters well into the night, trading recipes back and forth, and in a sort of sisterly rivalry, pushing each other further and further on, while Loisette would sort of slip in and out of the scene. There were some bumps in the road. Paul was posted to the U.S. consulate in Marseille, and Julia was upset because she was being forced out of her comfort zone there. But in typical fashion, she was able to turn those lemons into a tarte citron by learning all the Mediterranean flavors and how to make dishes like bouillabaisse, which she loved. And she told me that she thought that she has come up with the true bouillabaisse recipe because she talked to practically every person in Marseille, each of whom had their own bouillabaisse recipe. And then she consulted the old books, and she'd come up with what she thought was la vraie recette, the real recipe. They kept moving, thanks to the State Department. They moved from Marseille to Plittersdorf, Germany. Then they were in Washington, D.C. for a bit. Then they were in Oslo. And the book grew and grew in size to 700 pages on nothing but soups and poultry. They, at this point, had a contract with Houghton Mifflin here in Boston. When Houghton Mifflin saw this 700 pages on soups and poultry, they blanched and told them to go back to the drawing board. They rejected the book. But then after a crucial meeting, Houghton Mifflin agreed to take another shot at it. It would be a much smaller book. It would be more comprehensive. It would be really designed for the American cook. However, on the second rejection, Houghton Mifflin executives advised Julia that the American housewife really wants something simple with a mix, which was hardly the book that they had produced. As you know, the book is a sort of a tour de force, and Julia sensed this, I think, right from the beginning. This was the book that she was writing for herself. As you may know, Julia had early on aspired to be a famous American novelist or short story writer. She wanted to work at the New Yorker. Neither of those things happened. But my take on this is that the recipes that she was developing, each one had meaning to her. Each one was like a little short story, a sort of distilled bit of experience. And one of the reasons that they sometimes read a little bit long is that she takes the time to give little histories or little asides, and she'll instruct you. She'll say, well, now, if the butter is starting to brown here, here's how to save it. And it's a very kind of a comforting, wise, informed presence. And that didn't come naturally, I don't think. I think she really had to work hard at her writing. I think Paul was instrumental in that. I think of him as the secret fourth gourmand, the very important power behind the scenes. And they worked very, very hard. Finally, thanks in large part to Avis Devoto here in Cambridge, and wife of the essayist Bernard Devoto, the manuscripal, as they called it, finally landed on the desk of perhaps the one person in all of New York, or perhaps the entire United States, who really understood this book. Her name was Judith B. Jones. She was a young editor at Knopf. She had made her mark early on as an editor at Doubleday when she discovered a book in the slush pile, a memoir, a diary of a young woman living in Amsterdam during the Nazi occupation. Judith Jones is the one who had discovered the Diary of Anne Frank. And so Blanche and Alfred Knopf had hired her away from Doubleday. Now, it turned out that Judith Jones had lived in Paris at about the same time as Paul and Julia, and they may have even have been at parties together, or they certainly went to many of the same places, probably passed each other on the street, but didn't know each other then. And it turned out that Judith Jones was a gourmand and had been looking for a French cookbook for the American market. And suddenly this manuscript lands on her desk. And so she decides to try out a few of the recipes. And she took the manuscript home. She learned how to flip an omelet in the French manner by practicing with beans. And she told me that the beans would sometimes fly out of the pan, and she lived in a penthouse apartment, still does. And the beans got down into the slats on her deck, and in the spring would sprout up. One of the breakthrough recipes for her was boeuf bourguignon, which sounds very fancy, but is really just a beef stew. It's a traditional French dish. It's delicious, and it's quite easy to make. But The technique is key here. One of the things that Julia says is you have to dry the meat very carefully and not overcrowd the pan when you're browning the meat. And when Judith saw that, she knew she was in the hands of somebody who really knew what they were talking about. So, Judith went to Alfred Knopf and made the case for the sale of this book, for the purchase of this book. And after some grumbling, Alfred agreed, and Judith offered the grand advance of $1,500. And the three authors were delighted. After two rejections, this was, and nearly a decade of work, this was a shaft of light from the sky. Then came the matter of a title, and they tried out all sorts of things. How, why, what to cook in the French way. One of my favorites is Food, France, Fun. They finally decided on mastering the art of French cooking, and that was a Judith's idea. Julia loved the active verb mastering, which implied that it was an ongoing process and that one never fully mastered French cooking. Alfred Knopf thought it was a terrible title and said, if anyone buys the book with that title, I'll eat my hat. To which Judith Jones still likes to say, bon appetit. Mastering was finally published in October of 1961, 9 years after Julia started work on it. And at that point, the stars were really aligned. The Kennedys were in the White House with a French chef, Americans were traveling abroad, and France was considered chic. The book did well from the start and has never been out of print. The book grew out of Julia Simca and Loisette's love of cookery and what Julia called sweet little old France. This brings us to site 3, La Pichoune. Julia thought of France as her North Star, her spiritual home, and had long wanted to buy an apartment in Paris. But when Simca offered her the chance to lease an old potato patch on the Bramafam property in Provence, Julia described it as a dream come true. And she and Paul built a house. It was a house built on friendship. They agreed with a handshake that Paul and Julia would build a simple house on Simca and Jean's property, use it as long as they liked, and would then turn it back over to Simca's family. Now, this was a very un-American, very un-French deal, but it was quintessential Julia and Simca. The property is in Place Cassier, which is just outside of Cannes. It's on a little hillside. The driveway is a sort of it's a dark, somewhat obscure hole in a giant hedge. The road itself is a rutted dirt road. It twists and turns and goes up the hill. And at the top of the hill, you see a very simple house that's very typical of that region. It's got white stucco walls, red tile roof, and a stone terrace. Inside, there's a big living room, a small kitchen with the pegboards on the wall where Paul outlined all of Julia's batterie de cuisine, and 3 smallish bedrooms. They called it La Pichoune, which means the little thing, and they really thought of it as their little retreat. It was a place that they would come to as frequently as they could to unwind and recharge. Now, to tell you the truth, the French don't really care about Julia Child. Most of them don't even know who she is. And she liked it that way. She loved to be able to go back to France, which was the site of her original inspiration, and to delve back into that, get in touch with that primary source material. But there were many American fans who were constantly trying to find Julia's house and drop in unannounced to say hello. Julia had typically befriended many of the locals, and they would take great pleasure in misdirecting the tourists or saying things like, oh, the Childs aren't here right now, while Julia sat up in the house on the hill. Childs had a steady stream of gastronomical guests, people like Jim Beard and MFK Fisher. They befriended local chefs like the Michelin 3-star chef Roger Verger at the famous Moulin de Mougins, which is not far away. And they, of course, loved to shop and cook. Simca's much larger house, which was called Le Mas Vieux, is a few hundred yards away, and she and Julia had beat a pathway between their two kitchen doors across the lawn. The house was the site of many fabulous dinner parties and events, and though Julia and Simca ultimately had a professional falling out over the production of Mastering the Art Volume 2, they remained friends and neighbors in Place Cassier all their lives. And it was there that Jim Beard overindulged and almost had a heart attack. It was there that Paul suffered a series of nosebleeds and heart palpitations that resulted in his early strokes. It was there in 1976 that I went with my family and visited Paul and Julia and watched the Olympics from Montreal on a little tiny black and white television on the veranda. It was a very hot day, I remember. Paul had set the TV up on a stool and was translating for us kids from the French into English, while Julia sat in the corner and, on the smallest grill I've ever seen, made probably the most delicious grilled chicken I've ever had in my life, and I always wish I knew what kind of marinade she'd used. It was a magical moment. Eventually, it all came to an end. My grandparents died, Jim Beard and Jean-Fiche Bachet died, Paul died in 1989, Simca died in 1991 at age 87. And at that point, Julia said, quote, "The heart had gone out of the place. It was the people I shared it with more than the property itself that I loved." And Provence itself had changed. It had become much more crowded with people and jammed with houses. There's a Club Med around the corner. The old marketplaces that she used to love to go to had been supplanted by the Super U supermarket. And it looked, she said, just like Southern California. So in June of 1992, Julia, accompanied by Phyla and her family, Susie Davidson, cooked a final daube, handed the keys to La Peach over to Jean's sister, and drove away for the very last time. And as Phyla noted, she was unsentimental about it, though she always remembered the house very fondly. It happened that I visited La Peach this summer, and I think Julia would be happy to know that it's now run as a cooking school by Kathy Alex, an American who was the first woman to cook at the Moulin du Mougin and is a former student of Simca and Julia's. And I can tell you, the place looks great. Merci.
Okay. We now have some time for questions, if anybody would like to come. And I think the deal is that you go to that microphone there and ask questions of any one of us.
Someone
There
has
are
to be
any.
brave enough.
Oh, and introduce yourself, too. Sorry, yes. Who are you?
I'm Dolores Hayden, and I have a question for Alice Kaplan. It does seem that when the book finally was published in the United States, there was a tremendously positive reception, and I wonder if you might speculate about whether there were particular reasons that Americans were so receptive to the book at that time. Did it have anything to do with the number of Americans who perhaps had traveled in Europe or had been to France and wanted to replicate some of that?
That's a great question. I mean, it's not for nothing that I put up that slide of Jackie Bouvier, who was on the Smith Study Abroad program in 1949. Now, from studying subsequent generations of these students on study abroad, men and women, they always came back from France with memories of food, memories of the markets, and so on. So that when Mastering the Art came out, it had a receptive audience among generations of students with this background of traveling in France. They would always come back and say, and the ones I interviewed would say, "I couldn't find that yogurt. Where I wanted a coq au vin, you know, I want a boeuf bourguignon." So I think it's not for nothing that the book had such a huge reception. And in fact, even if you look at a subsequent generation of gastronomic culture in the United States, Alice Waters, became enamored of French food on her junior year abroad and started Chez Panisse in the mid-'70s. So it continues.
If I could just add something too. A lot of the American GIs came back to the States after the war with stories of how fabulous that French food was. And that contributed to it as well. But I think one of the most important things that can be summed up in 2 words, Craig Claiborne. Craig Claiborne called the book the greatest cookbook on French food ever written. And he was a really prominent authority at the time, one of the few food critics in the United States. And after he posted that in the New York Times, that book just took off.
Yeah. Julia used to say, I just hit the zeitgeist just right. People
Right,
were ready
right.
for my book. Are there any other questions, or would someone else like to? Aha, Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael Bryan Dunn. I have a question for you, Alex. I had the great pleasure, of course, of playing Ivan Cousins in the film, and thank you. Before I did this film, I hadn't yet met Phyla. I met Phyla on the set my first day on set in New York. And I didn't know who Ivan Cousins was. I wasn't given a script. We weren't really allowed that until we really got on set. So I had no ways of really kind of finding out who this was, and I knew a little bit about Julia. So I went to the Barnes and Noble and looked in the shelves and went to the index, looked for Ivan Cousins, and he was there, and I was like, here, there's a clue. So I was able to find out a little bit about him through that book, but also more importantly, which leads to my question, was the book itself. I found myself reading it, and it reads like a gorgeous novel. And one that I'm reminded of by your descriptions that you just spoke about. It immersed me into that time period and the era, and I envisioned the places that she was in Rue de Lou. I had this incredible romantic vision of what Rue de Lou might have looked like, and then when I arrived on the set, I got to wander around the set, which is like one big huge football field of it's like a playground for an actor, because it's one room after the other. I mean, right next to the Rue de Lou, their apartment was the kitchen, and then right down there and around the corner was the Cordon Bleu, and then I could go a little further and I could see the street scene of where they were, and it was the detail of what they did on that set was exactly how I pictured it in the book, and it was so exciting it just kind of created the whole thing for me. So, with all of that said, it was such an incredible honor to be on that set and with all those people that were all magical, and it was a very happy set. I'll just say that, and the food was great too.
Yes, it was.
I wonder what it was like actually collaborating on the book with Julia, and how that was recreated. How all of those things were recreated, and how much was her. I guess that. Can you say a little about that?
Sure. Thanks for the story/question. That was great. I had an opportunity to go see that set myself, and what's funny about it is it was in Long Island City, Queens, in a very industrial neighborhood, and then you walk into this kind of hangar-like space, and suddenly you're transported to Paris, 1948. Right. It was really quite magical. The first part of your question is what it was like to work with Julia. Well, I have to say it was the most fun I've ever had in working on a book. As Phyla noted, I'm Paul Child's great-nephew. So I grew up with Paul and Julia, not only watching them on television, but also as flesh and blood members of the family. So I knew them quite well. They never had kids of their own, but they had what I think of as surrogate children. And I was lucky, my sisters and I were lucky to be amongst those. But the surrogate children for Julia included people they met at the gas station or famous chefs or, they were they had a very wide and eclectic group of friends. And when you went to dinner at their house over here at 103 Irving Street, you never knew who you'd be sitting next to, and it was always entertaining. And sometimes it didn't work, and that was part of the excitement. So the process of writing the book, well, the book that we wrote, her memoir, which is called My Life in France, had originally been Paul's idea. Paul and my grandfather, Charlie, were twin brothers. And my grandmother, Frederica, and Julia were very close friends. And while Paul and Julia were living in Paris and Marseille and abroad, they would write to my grandparents every week. Usually, Julia's letters would be a page, maybe a page and a half long, typewritten, full of misspellings, a lot of capital letters, very sort of chatty about what's in the marketplace and what the weather was like. Paul's letters were very much longer, 6 or 7 pages, carefully thought out. Sometimes he would do rough drafts of these letters, and then he would add little sketches. He would paste photographs and things in the margins. He really cared about transmitting this experience, and and then my grandparents would write back, and so the family kept these letters. And Paul, in 1969, thought it might be a good idea to do a book of these letters that people might be interested, because by that point, Julia was a celebrity. The publishers were not interested in that idea, but I think it was the spark that burned long and slow, and Julia always wanted to do a memoir about those years when she went to France and learned to cook, which she told me were her favorite years of her life, when she experienced a flowering of the soul, as she put it. She discovered her raison d'etre. And so I, for years, had heard about what she called the France book. She'd always say, oh, I'm working on the France book. And we kept waiting for this memoir to come out because, when we'd have Thanksgiving together or we'd see each other in Maine or in New York, she would tell us these stories, and they were always fantastic, whether they were large or small stories. And I knew she had a lot of great material. But the book never appeared. I grew up, I became a writer in my own right, and I had long wanted to work with Julia on something for obvious reasons, and had offered to help her with the memoir at one point, and she was very self-reliant and politely declined. She didn't shut the door. She just said, no, I think I'm going to work on it. Eventually, it was the winter of 2003, December of 2003, that week between Christmas and New Year's, and I flew out to Santa Barbara to see Julia, as I did every year. And I said, well, and at this point, she was 91 years old. And truth be told, her health was sort of waxing and waning at that point, although her mind was sharp as a tack. And I said, how's the France book coming, Julia? And she said, well, it's not so good. And I said, well, I'm here to help. And this time, she looked at me for a long time, and then she said, okay, let's try it. And I was completely unprepared. I didn't have a pen or a notebook, so I ran down to the corner and got some index cards and a ballpoint pen from the pharmacy there, ran back, and said, okay, show me what you've got. So she pulled open her desk drawer, and I was expecting to see this large manuscript that she'd been working on since 1969. And instead, what I saw was a series of very neatly organized manila envelopes filled with airmail paper. And those were the letters that Paul and Julia and my grandparents had written. And she had saved those letters and had been thinking about this book, and it was in her mind. She just hadn't committed it to paper. So my job was to extract those stories from her. And it wasn't easy going at first. We began that January of 2004. And one of the things that you've heard today is that Julia was genuinely a modest person. She really didn't like to talk about herself. So as an interviewer, it was a challenge. I'd say, now, Julia, tell me about your house in Paris. Describe it to me. And she'd say, oh, it was just an apartment. Now, how is your place in Brooklyn? She was always turning it around to me or deflecting in some way. And it was very difficult. And I thought to myself, well, now I see why the book hasn't been written, because she doesn't like to talk about herself. And finally, I discovered the key to unlock her was to read from the letters, specifically Paul's letters, because he was a very descriptive writer. And he would not only describe what was happening in the embassy, but he would describe, you know, the details of their bedroom. He would describe walking up to Montmartre. And this got Julia going, and it allowed her to talk about France and Paul, and by the way, herself, in an indirect way. And it also started to stir the subconscious, and stories started to come out, kind of bubbling up from the spring, as it were. And I learned very quickly that I had to keep a little notebook with me at all times, because we'd be at the farmer's market, and she'd see some strawberries, and that would set off a memory, and if I didn't write it down right then, an hour later, she wouldn't remember the story. And so I remember one time driving her on the Pacific Coast Highway, which is a twisty, fast road, and she's telling me a story, and I'm driving and writing on my knee at the same time. And we just had a great, great time. I would go out once a month to Santa Barbara, and I would stay for a few days. We would usually do a couple of hours of interviews in the morning, and she would take a nap, and I'd go off and type some stuff up, and then we'd have lunch, and we would often, she was still mischievous at that point, and one of her favorite things to do was we would go to a hamburger place and get some burgers to go, and she'd say, well, now let's go find a view. And we'd be driving along, and she'd see a driveway leading to an overlook of the ocean, but there would be a big private sign sitting there. And she'd say, well, I'll just go up here. And I'd say, well, Julia, it says private. I don't feel right about this. She said, oh, what? You know, if someone asks us, we'll just say we're looking for Mr. Smith. And so I said, okay, I'm game. We drove up, and we have our burger overlooking the ocean, and never got hassled once, and had a great time. So that was kind of how it went. And the longer we worked together, the more her stories started coming out. And then I was able to start writing little vignettes. And the book is really a collection of stories that are strung together. And the tone that we were striving for is as if you're sitting at a cafe table, maybe having a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, and Julia is telling you, not every story, but a few of her favorite stories about how she evolved as a cook and as a person. And in that sort of conversational way, and Judith Jones was very helpful in getting that tone right. And so I would write up these vignettes, and I'd print them out, and I would bring them with me, and Julia would avidly correct them and make suggestions. And we structured the book, and we worked together for 8 months until August 13th of 2004, which was 2 days shy of her 92nd birthday. And that was that night that she passed away. And we had people coming in from all around the world to celebrate her 92nd birthday. And that weekend turned into a sort of Irish wake where, Phyla remembers, we were laughing and crying and telling stories and eating and drinking, and it was...
and not sleeping.
Not sleeping much, and eating some more.
Right.
And it was an epic 3 days that I'll never forget, in a very fitting way for Julia to go out, and you know, you could speculate maybe she even did it on purpose, knowing that all of her friends were coming in. Anyway, it took me another year to finish the book after that, and you know, we really had no idea how it would do because Julia had passed away, and luckily it had its second life, or not a second life. It had its life. It came out strong. It started off quite well, but then when the movie came out, it had a second life. And I think I'll leave your second question for another time.
Well,
I think we have some other people who would like to talk.
What I can add to Michael's question is when I went on set, Nora Ephron took me around and showed me the apartment in Rue de Lou, and she said, how does it look? And I said, it looks like, I feel like I've walked into one of Paul's photos of Rue de Lou. It was that accurate. So anyway, okay.
Hi, I'm Nancy Cott. I was struck by the mention of MFK Fisher going to dinner at Julia's, and I hadn't known they had known one another, although actually thinking about it, I realized MFK Fisher was only, less than 10 years older than Julia Child. And so I'm curious to know about the two women's relationship, if any of you know how they related to one another, and also if you have any thought of how to compare each one's relation to France as an American. I also, subsidiary to that, I know I've read somewhere that Julia was very disappointed that Mastering the Art of French Cooking was not translated into French. And so I'd be very interested to hear any wisdom you have on that.
Nancy, you of all
question.
people should know MFK Fisher's letters are there, and the letters...
No, I know,
between-
but I'm not, I haven't looked at them myself.
Yeah,
so,
no, the letters between Julia and MFK Fisher are classic. They were great pen pals, and they did meet several times. The first time they didn't hit it off at all. Julia found MFK, Mary Frances, to be kind of cold and hard to penetrate. And I think that she might have, Mary Frances might have found Julia to be what she thought was a little flighty. They didn't get each other, but once they read each other, they realized that there were, there was an enormous camaraderie to be had. And they wrote to each other all the time. They were dear friends. They exchanged a lot of correspondence about food. Those letters are fabulous, and all those letters at the Schlesinger. And the ones that Alex was mentioning before, Paul's letters, are some of the most beautiful prose I've ever read. I mean, he was a gorgeous writer. The first letter that he sent to your grandfather in 1938 said, please keep all of my letters for the future. He knew, he had an idea. He said, this is going to be the story of my life. And over the next, I guess, 35 years, those letters, which made up thousands of pages, not only of the most beautiful prose, but written gorgeously. His handwriting changed several times over the years, but always he made such an effort to write beautifully. Are extraordinary. My wife, while I was writing my book, my wife kept reminding me, this is not a Paul Child biography, just remember, because those letters are fantastic. And the same with Julia's letters to Mary Frances, very revealing. They became very good friends. Anybody else?
Well, I wanted to say something about why the mastering is not translated. It's just fascinating to me. No one I know in France has heard, no French person
Right.
I know has heard of Julia Child. And in fact, she was virtually unknown until the film came to France, and now people know the film. You could speculate about why this is. I mean, it's not been a great, French people are supposed to have cooking so much in their bones that they don't need a book to show them how. It's also the case that they may not want to get lessons on their own national culture from a foreigner. Sometimes the mirror just doesn't work in both ways.
Right. Good point.
My name is Kenny Lyman, and I was interested in the political situation and how the widespread anti-American feeling in the late 40s and 50s affected Julia Child and Paul Child too, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a very good and complicated question. I mean, you could just imagine what it was like for them. He was working for the Marshall Plan, so he was part of this gung-ho American sort of invasion of France after the war to make them go the right way, prevent them from going communist. At the same time, he was very skeptical about all of that, and he thought it was sort of BS, and he sympathized with the French mentality and, not enthusiastic about the profit motive and so on. You also have to figure that their lives were constantly interrupted by strikes. They had to take out their flash Buick and go pick up people to get them to the office when the metros weren't working. And so it was the political situation was very, very present in their daily lives. And they had friends who were, very political on the left, but not as far as I could tell the communist left.
Except there was one woman.
Yeah.
Who was it? Jane somebody?
Yeah.
From the OSS.
An artist from
An
the
artist
OSS,
who was a communist.
But an American.
No, she was married to a communist.
She was.
Yeah,
And
Yeah,
that was
Jane
why
Foster, that's
Paul
right.
was brought up
yeah.
in front
a
of
good
the Committee of
That's a good point.
Un-American Activities, was because supposedly Julia and Paul had been consorting with communists because they were friends with these people.
But
Yes.
she was a spy, right?
She
I mean, she
was.
was a clandestine
That's
communist.
That's right,
Right.
exactly
But
right.
in the French scene where there was a huge Communist Party culture, they didn't hang around in that scene.
Right.
I just wanted to add what Alice was saying. I think it's kind of ironic that Paul Child, who was probably spiritually more French than American. His job at the U.S. Information Service was to essentially sell America to the French because they were considered an occupying power. And the general French view was that Americans were the GIs. His job was to bring cultural events and cultural icons from America to France. And so his job was to organize a lecture series and to present exhibits, essentially using what we now call soft power as opposed to hard military power to win the hearts and minds in the current lexicon of the French. And I think he did it with tongue-in-cheek in a way. I think he did the best job he could, but he certainly wasn't a Mr. Rah-Rah American. In fact, he was famous around the embassy for not playing office politics, and as soon as the day was over, he was out of there and went back with Julia, and they would go out walking around Paris. And I just always thought it was interesting that here's a guy who is essentially a marketer for the United States, who didn't even believe the message himself.
Right.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I think the very first American congressman who went over there and suspected Paul, a gentleman from Indiana, was outraged because he said there was just communist art that this man was presenting. It was an exhibit of, I think, maybe the 25 greatest American artists at the time. The man had absolutely no idea what he was talking about, and this is what he brought Paul up for.
Right, right.
Hi, my name is Ann Eldridge, and I will show my ignorance about Julia's early life in asking this question, but nobody really talked very much about it. And the reason I ask that is that my husband and I are contemporaries, classmates actually at Harvard, and I grew up in New York City, and when I had an uncle and aunt who lived in Paris, whom I never met until after the war because of the war separating the countries. And when my uncle and aunt came to New York City in 1950, they took me and my family to lunch at Le Pavillon, which already was establishing French culture in New York City. My husband grew up in a small city in Ohio where at the local restaurant there were two kinds of salad, green Jell-O with vegetables and red Jell-O with fruit. And I wonder what about her early life prepared her for being receptive to French culture and French cooking, which would have been so alien to most of the United States at that time.
Not much in her early life with her family, although, you know, her family did travel quite a bit.
Well, also, you know, her grandmother had a French cook in their house.
That's right.
And so some of that was passed down through the family, but
Right.
not much. It never reached her mother or her father. Julia did not have good food in their house in Pasadena.
And a further obstacle was that her father, Big John McWilliams, was very suspicious of the French.
Yeah.
Before she went over to Paris, he told her that the French men would pinch her derriere and that the women would look down their long Gallic noses at her and think she was, you know, not chic enough. And so, although she had been to Asia during the war, she really felt unworldly and intimidated when she arrived off the coast of Le Havre on the SS America. And it was that first meal in Rouen that started to open up her senses, as she put it. And I think it was a temperamental issue, really. I think she was just open to experience.
I agree.
She was looking for her purpose in life. And she had no idea what Paul was getting her into by bringing her to France, which was his favorite place. He'd lived there in the 20s,
Right.
knew food and wine very well, had spent time with Gertrude Stein and Hemingway and so on, and was a very cultured older man. He was 10 years older than she was, and he couldn't wait to bring her over there. And she described herself as a rather loud, unformed, kind of a dilettantish Pasadena girl, but she knew deep down that there was something that she was meant to do. And when I asked her about not having kids, for example, it was a subject she didn't like to talk about. She said, well, we tried, it didn't work. You know, that was it. That was the extent of the conversation. But later she said to me, you know, if I had had kids, I probably wouldn't have had my career because I would have put all of my energy into my children. And I've also seen her say this elsewhere, that she always felt that she was destined to do something great. She just didn't know what that was, and it was a question of finding it. And so I think that she was predisposed to be open to experience, not to have the sort of typical expat experience in Paris, but to really dive into what French life was like. And you know, she used to say, well, I think I really am French, only nobody ever told me.
There's an early letter of hers, of Paul's actually, at the Schlesinger, in which he says that one of the things that I'm worried about with Julia is that she's kind of an empty vessel. But Paul realized that that empty vessel had a big receptacle, and he began filling up the tank. I mean, he really did. Julia gobbled up everything he put in front of her: literature, politics, the arts, philosophy, and of course, food. She was ready to devour the world, really.
Exactly.
I just want to take off from there for a second because I think this is really interesting. Their relationship is fascinating. And I think of it almost as a Pygmalion relationship where Paul was initially the elder statesman. He was a sophisticated man who'd lived around the world. He was training her to be a cultured woman of the world. And it was when he retired from the U.S. Information Service, it just happened to coincide with the time when Julia's book came out, and then she got on television. And she became the almost senior member, and he willingly stepped back into the shadows and was still a very important influence, but he was more behind the scenes. And that dynamic was really a powerful one because they were two sides of a coin. And he was crucial, and that's why she dedicated her memoir to him. And she always said that, you know, she couldn't have had her career without Paul Child. But I think that sort of Pygmalion relationship is quite fascinating.
Absolutely.
Right.
You know, when reading your book, Reading My Life in France, I was so struck by her anger at her father. And I think if she was so receptive to those French tastes, it's that she had the bitter taste in her mouth of everything that she had eaten growing up in Pasadena.
And yet, he remained a very important force in her life. And I feel like Paul and Big John were two poles, and she would bounce back and forth, mostly on the Paul end of the spectrum. But to be honest, she did rely financially on her father to a certain extent. Not entirely, but his financial support was important, especially in those early years in Paris.
And
So
she
it's
loved
nice-
to-
And the other thing is that she loved her father.
that's what I was
and
just about to say, yeah.
It was she felt a lot of grief about the fact that that he was not able to accept Paul or Ivan. And she and I, well, that time I talked about in 1984, one of the things we cried about was her father and that distance that she felt from him and how much she yearned to have a closer relationship with him and for Grandpa to have a closer relationship with Paul.
He never gave her the satisfaction, her father, throughout her entire life. And even when she hit her stride and had her greatest popularity, he refused to acknowledge it. I mean, you know, here she was, the French chef. That was the ultimate knife through the heart, really.
Well, yeah, he was pretty sick by that time, Grandpa. Yeah.
I think for history's sake, there was one French cookbook before written by Joseph Donneau.
That's right.
He was the chef for the Burdens. And when I had 3 young children, the idea of having a personal chef was the greatest thing I ever heard of.
Yeah.
Julia loved
But
that cookbook.
Julia
of his.
didn't like the book.
Oh, no, that's not true.
But it was his attempt to put something of France into a book that we could follow. And I can tell you that I did make many things out of that book. But when I heard that Julia didn't like it, I put it aside.
Yes. Excuse me. Who are you? What's your name? Yeah.
Joan Challenor.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Pat Pratt, and I'm not really asking a question. I would like to say that we all know that Julia was a teacher and a writer, but she also was a television star, and that was, I think, I just want to raise this not as a question so much as a statement, that quite a lot of the success of the book initially began because she did her television show and everybody had to run out after Russ Morash had finished off the set for the day, and everybody would have to run out and buy the book. I think it was a dual balance of how the book became so popular, and then the rest is history.
Well, and William Sonoma did quite well with that too, because everybody would rush out and buy whatever it was, endive, and then the thing to cook it in.
Right.
So,
The book sold modestly well when it was first published in '61, but once she hit the air,
Yeah.
that book really exploded.
yeah, it
Yeah.
hit the stratosphere. Are there any more questions? Would anybody else like to ask? Or make any comments? Or any? Okay, thank you all very much.